Those Persian and allied ships that had survived the disaster at Salamis withdrew to Phalerum on the Attic mainland to rest and regroup. The defeat had been severe, but not decisive. Even after their losses, the great king's fleet may still have outnumbered the ships of the Hellenic Alliance. Herodotus and Plutarch offer no precise figures for the destruction, but Diodorus Siculus claims that the Persians lost 200 ships, while the Hellenes lost only 40. If accurate, the disparity was staggering, but the Persian navy remained formidable. And there were still the Egyptian contingents. These ships had been dispatched to the western approaches of Salamis to block any Greek escape toward Megara and the Isthmus of Corinth. Their fate remained uncertain, but it's known that they'd not borne the brunt of the main engagement. The greater loss for Xerxes may not have been ships, but men. Many Persians, Medes, and Saka were unable to swim. Thrown into the sea amidst shattered hulls and burning wreckage, countless soldiers drowned. Yet even this tragedy didn't cripple the invasion. Xerxes still commanded vast land forces on the Greek mainland, and many Greek states that had already medized could still be called upon for support. He had already achieved some extraordinary results. In just 3 months, the borders of the Achaemenid Empire now formally extended into northern and central Greece. Athens itself had been taken and sacked, fulfilling one of the central aims of the campaign. Salamis and the little hiccup at Thermopylae aside, Xerxes' forces had faced few setbacks on the campaign thus far. As for the Hellenes, they demonstrated that they understood their own terrain far better than the great king and his advisors. For that miscalculation, Xerxes had paid dearly, in ships, in treasure, and above all, in men. And now, there was another danger. The Persians were far from home. At its height under Xerxes, the Achaemenid-Persian Empire stretched from the fringes of Europe and Egypt in the west to the Indus River in the east, a distance of at least 2,500 to 2,800 miles, or roughly 4,000 to 4,500 kilometers. It was the largest political entity in the history of the world up until that time. And so, the longer Xerxes remained occupied with his campaigns in Greece, the greater the risk that unrest might ignite elsewhere within the realm. He would have remembered well what had occurred during the reign of his uncle, Cambyses II. While campaigning in Egypt, a pretender, posing as his brother, Bardia, though some modern scholars suspect it may have been Bardia himself, seized the throne in his absence. The crisis triggered widespread revolt across the empire. Only through the ruthless campaigns of Xerxes' father, Darius I, was imperial authority restored. The lesson was unmistakable. Distance from the imperial center could be as dangerous as any Greek fleet, and possibly even more so. The longer Xerxes remained in Europe, the more precarious his position became. News of the naval disaster at Salamis would inevitably travel east, to the royal court, to rival factions, and to ambitious nobles watching closely for signs of weakness. A great king could command obedience through strength and fear, but he could also lose it through failure. The setback at Salamis also carried wider implications. Greek city-states already within the empire, particularly those in Ionia and across the Aegean islands, might see the Persian defeat as an opportunity to revolt and cast off the Persian yoke. And then there was another strategic reality. With so many ships destroyed and seasoned sailors lost at Salamis, Xerxes' safest route home was the one he'd taken into Europe, north through Boeotia and Thessaly, across Macedonia and Thrace, and back over the pontoon bridges spanning the Hellespont into Asia. But What if the Hellenes reached the straits first? What if they destroyed those bridges? The great king and the bulk of his army would be stranded in Greece, cut off from the imperial heartlands of southwestern Iran and Mesopotamia, thousands of kilometers from the centers of power that sustained his rule. Herodotus tells us that Xerxes was deeply troubled by this possibility, and that it shaped the decision he would soon make. When Xerxes fully understood the scale of the calamity, he became afraid that one of the Ionians might advise the Hellenes to sail to the Hellespont and destroy the bridges, if they did not think of it themselves. He would then be cut off in Europe and in mortal danger. So he began to plan his escape, but wanted to conceal this from both the Hellenes and his own men. Another man who had reason to fear the consequences of Salamis was Mardonius, the king's cousin, and, until now, the most forceful advocate of the Greek campaign. At court, no one had pressed Xerxes more insistently to launch a punitive expedition against Athens and the defiant Greek states than Mardonius. Though the current disaster was not entirely his doing, Mardonius understood the realities of court politics. If Persia's gains in Greece were reversed, blame would fall heavily upon the man who had been most eager to launch the invasion in the first place. And so, Herodotus tells us Mardonius approached the great king with a proposal. Mardonius could see that Xerxes thought the battle had been a complete disaster, and suspected that the king had already decided on a speedy withdrawal from Athens. He reckoned it was likely he would have to pay the price for persuading the king to go to war with Hellas, so he decided that it would be best to take a gamble, to conquer or to die a noble death in a great adventure. He was inclined to the view that he was going to conquer Hellas, so, with that in mind, he put a proposal to the king. "Master, do not grieve for what has happened to us, or think of it as a disaster. The success of our enterprise will not be decided by ship timber, but by men and horses. These Hellenes think they have won total victory, but not a single one of them is prepared to come ashore and face you, nor will any of those already on dry land stand against you, and those who did have paid the price. So, let us make an immediate attempt on the Peloponnese, if you so decide. On the other hand, if you choose to hold back, that is also an option. Do not be depressed by the present situation, because the Hellenes cannot possibly avoid being subjugated by you, nor can they escape paying the penalty for the harm they have done you just now and formerly. I urge you to do what I recommend." Mardonius then blamed the Phoenicians, Egyptians, Cypriots, and others for the defeat at Salamis, and requested that the great king grant him a force of 300,000 men to subdue the rest of Greece, specifically the Peloponnese. Xerxes was receptive to the proposal, but told Mardonius he would make his decision after consulting his advisors. Chief among them was Artemisia, whom Xerxes greatly respected, for she had correctly warned him not to attack the Hellene naval forces at Salamis. Had the great king listened to her rather than the majority of his advisors, he might have been in a far stronger position to confront the Hellenes and compel their submission. Now, he asked her what counsel she would offer under the present circumstances. Artemisia is said to have advised him to withdraw safely and return home, leaving Mardonius to continue the campaign in Greece. If Mardonius succeeded, the victory would still belong to Xerxes. If he failed, the loss would be of little consequence so long as the king and his household remained secure. Either way, Xerxes would preserve his position and avoid unnecessary risk. Xerxes was pleased with this answer and chose to follow Artemisia's advice. Mardonius was then summoned into the king's presence and told that he could select whatever troops he deemed necessary to achieve what he had now promised, that is, the subjugation of the Peloponnese. That, at least, is the version presented by Herodotus and other classical writers. Yet, it may not fully reflect what Xerxes and his commanders actually intended. According to Herodotus, on the very night after the battle, Xerxes ordered what remained of his fleet, anchored at Phaleron, to hastily embark for the Hellespont in order to secure the pontoon bridges and ensure the army's retreat to Asia. At the same time, however, he left behind a substantial force on the mainland, one clearly visible to the Hellenes across the strait. Themistocles and the Hellene forces seem to have assumed that the Persian fleet was still nearby. They must have been stunned when they realized that it had slipped away under cover of night. As Herodotus recounts, "The morning after the battle, the Hellenes saw that the barbarian army was still in position and assumed that the fleet was still at Phalerum. Expecting to fight again, they made ready to defend themselves. However, when they had established that the ships had gone, they immediately decided to give chase and followed Xerxes' fleet as far as Andros. When they had reached Andros without sighting the enemy, they held a council." Known for its scenic beauty, Andros is the northernmost island in the Cyclades, lying roughly 100 kilometers from Athens, which is a considerable distance. If the Hellene fleet had sailed this far without encountering a single Persian ship, it strongly suggests that Xerxes had no real intention of advancing on the Peloponnese. Without naval support, the chances of the Persian army successfully attacking the Hellenes holding the Isthmus of Corinth was extremely slim. Moreover, it would have been exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, for any land force large enough to conquer and occupy the Peloponnese to operate without secure supply lines from the sea. This helps explain why, throughout their advance from Asia, the Persian army remained closely coordinated with its fleet. By withdrawing that fleet, Xerxes effectively ruled out any large-scale campaign against the Peloponnese, at least for the time being. After the setback at Salamis, Xerxes likely realized that the risks of confronting the Hellenes at the Isthmus were too great. This calculation echoed the decision of Datis and Artaphernes after the Battle of Marathon, when they declined to press an attack on Athens. Yet, this didn't mean that Persian ambitions had been abandoned, only delayed. In the meantime, the main army could withdraw from Attica, while Mardonius and a substantial contingent remained in regions such as Boeotia and Thessaly, territories that were more sympathetic to the Persian cause. The withdrawal of the fleet from Phaleron may also have served a strategic purpose: to draw the Hellenes' attention away from Xerxes' land forces and toward the Persian navy, encouraging them to pursue it and attempt to destroy the pontoon bridges at the Hellespont. Those bridges remained vital, as they could facilitate the arrival of reinforcements in the following year. The Hellespont now became Themistocles' primary objective. He urged Eurybiades and the other commanders to sail there at once and destroy the bridges, thereby trapping the great king and his army in Europe. The Spartan commander, however, opposed the plan. According to Herodotus, Themistocles proposed that they should continue the pursuit on a course through the islands and sail directly to the Hellespont to destroy the bridges. However, Eurybiades spoke against this, arguing that the destruction of the bridges could have very bad consequences for Hellas. He reasoned that if the great king was forced to stay in Europe, he would not remain inactive because, if he did so, he could neither carry on with his mission nor find a way to get home, and his army would die of starvation. However, if he were to take things actively in hand before it came to that, it was quite possible all of Europe, city by city, nation by nation, would be brought over to his side, either by conquest or by treaty. He would then be sustained by the fruits of the Hellenes' yearly harvests. But, in Eurybiades' view, the king would not stay in Europe after being defeated at sea, and so should be allowed to make his escape and return to his own country. From then on, he declared, the fighting should be over barbarian territory. Although Xerxes' fleet had suffered significant losses, the Persian army remained largely intact and could still, if commanded, wreak havoc in Attica or other areas near the Peloponnese. Many Greeks felt that it was far better to let their uninvited guests leave rather than force them to stay. While many Athenians were dismayed at not being able to pursue the Persians back to the Hellespont, others, after all they'd just endured, were happy that now they had the opportunity to rebuild their homes as well as prepare for the next harvest. This time, Themistocles lost the argument, but according to Herodotus and Plutarch, the shrewd Athenian still managed to turn the situation into a propaganda victory. They report that he once again sent a messenger to Xerxes, warning him that the Hellenes planned to destroy the pontoon bridges at the Hellespont. He later claimed to his fellow Greeks that it was he who deserved credit for Xerxes' retreat, having alerted the king to this supposed plot and thereby compelling him to withdraw in haste. At the same time, Themistocles may have been hedging his bets by doing the great king a favor he could later call upon. Many scholars are skeptical that Themistocles sent such a message twice within the span of a single week. The story may instead reflect the existence of back-channel communication between the Hellenes and Xerxes. After Salamis, it is possible that the Greeks agreed to grant the remaining Persian forces safe passage in exchange for their withdrawal from the Saronic Gulf. Some historians further suggest that Themistocles' actions were driven, at least in part, by self-interest. Roughly a decade after Salamis, both Athens and Sparta turned against him, forcing the once celebrated commander into exile. He eventually made his way to the court of the great king, where he was received as a valued advisor. In time, Themistocles was appointed governor of Magnesia, a wealthy city near Miletus on the Meander River, where he spent the final years of his life in relative comfort. But that's a story for another time. With the Persian armada now dispersed and heading home, Themistocles and Eurybiades led a brief campaign to collect reparations from islands and towns that they considered to have medized. This had less to do with the desire for revenge, and more with the need to pay off soldiers and debts that had been accrued during the most recent stages of the war. Trireme crews and shipbuilders needed to be paid, while homes, cities, and farms needed to be rebuilt. However, there were no reserves left in the public treasury or temple funds, as most of these had been looted during the Persian invasion, and there were few, if any, valuable spoils of war. What was worse is that many of Attica's farmers, assuming that their farms were still intact, had lost the best part of their yearly harvest, meaning that grain and other foodstuffs would have to be imported next year from Greek settlements in southern Italy, Sicily, and along the Black Sea, the latter which could now be easily cut off by the Persian fleet heading towards the Hellespont. Themistocles and his fellow commanders began island hopping around the Aegean, ostensibly to raise funds for the war effort. In reality, they were extorting money and demanding protection payments from small islands and statelets who didn't have the power to resist. Most, such as Paros and the city of Charistos on the southern coast of Evia, paid whatever was asked, but the island of Andros resisted. Herodotus recounts what happened next. The Hellenes now laid siege to the city of Andros. The Andrians were the first islanders to receive a demand for cash from Themistocles, but would not pay. Themistocles declared that the Athenians had the support of two powerful gods, named Persuasion and Pressure, and that the Andrians therefore had no option but to pay up. The Andrians replied that they could now understand why Athens was so great and prosperous, being blessed with the support of such useful gods. But they declared that for their part they were blessed with an extreme shortage of land, and supported by two useless gods who loved living on the island and would never leave it, and they were called penury and powerlessness. Since they were in possession of these gods, they could give no money, and the power of Athens could never be stronger than their weakness. The Andrians were put under siege because they responded in this way, and would not pay up. There was no limit to Themistocles' greed. He sent the same representatives as he had sent to the king with threatening messages to the other islands, demanding money and saying that if they did not pay what he asked, he would bring the Hellene fleet and blockade them to take their cities. By means of these threats, Themistocles collected large sums from the Carystians and Parians. They had heard that he was laying siege to Andros because the island had medized, and they knew of his reputation as the best of the generals, so they were afraid of him and paid up. I cannot say if other islands sent money, but I believe some did, not only these two. In any case, payment did not protect the Carystians from harm. However, the Parians bought Themistocles off, and they avoided being attacked. So, without the other commanders knowing, Themistocles sailed out of Andros and collected cash from the islanders. Other sources imply that Themistocles may have also profited by facilitating the return of anti-Persian exiles to their home cities. Other times, though, he seems to have offered his services to the highest bidder, as one man's complaint, recorded by Plutarch, states, "We know that Leto, who loves the truth, detests Themistocles, that liar, cheat, and traitor, who broke his word, and, for a sordid bribe, refused to restore his host, Timocreon, to his native roads, but pocketed 3 silver talents no less, and then sailed off." Power tends to corrupt, and this may have been the case with Themistocles. However, such accusations could also have been slandered against the great Athenian commander, whose reputation by Herodotus' day had soured considerably, due in part to attacks from his political rivals. During the time that Themistocles and other Hellene commanders were sailing around Andros, Paros, and the other islands of the Cyclades, Xerxes and the Persian army were marching back to Thessaly. It's here that the great king is reported to have given Mardonius pretty much the men he asked for. Herodotus explains, "The land forces with Xerxes waited for a few days after the sea battle, and then set off to Boeotia by the same routes as they had come. Mardonius felt he should escort the king. He had, in any case, decided that it was too late in the year for campaigning, and that it would be better to spend the winter in Thessaly, and then mount an attack on the Peloponnese in spring. On arrival in Thessaly, Mardonius selected as his first choice the whole of the Persian unit known as the Immortals, except for their commander, Hydarnes, who said that he would not leave the king's side. Next, from the rest of the Persians, he picked out all those who had body armor and the elite unit of 1,000 cavalry, and also the Medes, Saka, Bactrians, and Indians, both their infantry and their cavalry. He chose those nations' entire contingents, but from the rest he selected just a few individuals, either for their imposing looks or because he knew they had already done good service. He chose more of the Persians, with their torques and bracelets, than any other nation apart from the Medes. Actually, there were as many Medes as Persians, but the Medes were not as tough as the Persians. So, Mardonius mustered a total of 300,000 men, cavalry included. Like many of the figures given by Herodotus, the claim that Xerxes left 300,000 men with Mardonius at what was now the western edge of the Persian Empire is viewed with considerable skepticism. modern estimates suggest a force of perhaps 20,000 to, at most, 50,000 men. It's also unlikely that the Immortals were left behind, especially if their commander, Hydarnes, remained with the king. Such numbers, combined with the Empire's most elite troops, would have given Mardonius enough power to pose a potential challenge even to Xerxes himself. As noted earlier, without naval support, any large-scale offensive against the Hellenes fortified at the Isthmus of Corinth was unlikely to succeed. A withdrawal from Attica and regrouping in Boeotia and Thessaly would do little to bring Mardonius closer to conquering the Peloponnese. With the campaigning season drawing to a close, it appears that his role was simply to hold the line against the Athenians and Peloponnesians until the following year, when additional ships and troops could be assembled from across the Persian Empire for a renewed campaign. Leaving Mardonius with a substantial force, Xerxes marched north with the bulk of the army towards the Hellespont in Asia. The sources, however, suggest that this was no easy journey. Herodotus writes, Xerxes left Mardonius in Thessaly and made his way as quickly as he could to the Hellespont. He reached the bridgehead in 45 days, bringing with him not a fraction, as the saying goes, of his invasion force. Wherever they went, whatever people the land belonged to, they commandeered their food and devoured it. If they could find no food, they ate growing plants and peeled the bark and stripped the leaves off the trees, both cultivated and wild. They were starving and left the land bare. There was an outbreak of plague in the ranks, and many died of dysentery on the march. Xerxes left the sick behind, commanding each city he arrived at to care for them and feed them. These were cities in Thessaly, Cyrrhus of Paeonia, and Macedonia. In fact, the Persians who had marched through Thrace to the Hellespont made a hurried crossing to Abydos by ship, because they found the bridge of boats had been broken up by a storm and was no longer there. They paused at this point and were issued with more rations than they had been given on the whole march. Then, many of the army's survivors died from overeating and from the different water they were drinking. Those that were left finally arrived at Sardis with Xerxes. In the Epitome of the Philippic History of Pompeius Trogus, the 2nd century AD Roman historian Justin also comments on Xerxes' hasty withdrawal and the toll it took on his army. Nor had the land forces, which he had committed to his generals, a more fortunate retreat. For to their daily fatigue, and there is no rest to men in fear, was added the want of provisions. A famine of several days produced also disease, and so fatal was the infection that the roads were filled with dead bodies, and birds and beasts of prey, allured by the attraction of food, followed close upon the army. It's very plausible that food supplies were strained following the loss of several supply ships at Salamis. Unlike the march to Athens, when the army and navy moved largely in tandem, the return journey may have seen them separated, depriving the soldiers of reliable access to provisions carried by the fleet. As winter approached, the colder climate of northern Greece may have contributed to increased illness among the troops, particularly the Persians, who, native to the deserts of southwestern Iran, would have been unaccustomed to such harsh conditions. In the end, Xerxes, with at least some of his men, reached the Hellespont, and were able to cross back into Asia before continuing on to Sardis. Artabazus, one of Xerxes' most trusted generals, and a cousin of his father, Darius the Great, had just escorted the king to his ship for the crossing into Asia when, in mid-December of 480 BC, revolts broke out in the western Chalkidiki Peninsula, particularly at Plataea and Olynthus. Olynthus fell quickly, but Plataea held out, withstanding a 3-month siege and even a failed assault in which many of Artabazes' men perished in a flood. Afterward, Artabazes withdrew to rejoin Mardonius in Thessaly. Despite the setback at Salamis and the losses sustained during the retreat, Xerxes still controlled much of northern and central Greece, either directly or through loyal vassals. As the highest-ranking Persian commander remaining between Thrace and Attica, Mardonius had, in a sense, achieved what Herodotus suggests he had long desired: to govern Greece as its satrap. Though now stationed on the empire's frontier, Mardonius was well positioned to defend its newly acquired territories. His army could sustain itself without heavy reliance on seaborne supplies, thanks to the support of local populations such as the Boeotians, Thessalians, and Macedonians, who were far less hostile to Persian rule than the Athenians and Peloponnesians. The Persians also retained control of the northern Aegean, reducing the risk of isolation. Yet, one major obstacle remained to the southwest: the Hellene forces fortified at the Isthmus of Corinth. Sparta and its Peloponnesian allies continued to resist Persian domination. Although Athens and Attica had been overrun, the Athenians were rebuilding, and while still formidable at sea, they would, in time, pose a renewed threat on land as well. To resolve the Peloponnesian problem, Mardonius had two primary options. He could attempt to outflank and breach the Isthmus's defenses, or he could try to draw the Spartans and their allies into open battle on ground of his choosing, ideally terrain favorable to his cavalry, which had thus far seen limited action. Without strong naval support, the first option was effectively impractical. The second required the Peloponnesians to abandon their defensive advantages, something they had little incentive to do. An alternative strategy, however, was to isolate Sparta diplomatically. If Mardonius could weaken the Peloponnesian alliance or secure additional Greek allies, the balance might shift. His agents are said to have courted Argos, Elis, and Mantinea, longtime rivals of Sparta, whose cooperation could threaten Spartan control of the Peloponnese. Yet, while Mardonius already commanded substantial land forces, what he truly needed was a fleet. The most powerful navy belonged to Athens, followed by Aegina. The Aeginetans, however, were closely aligned with Sparta, and thus unreliable as potential allies. The Athenians, by contrast, were indispensable to the Peloponnesians at sea. If Mardonius could sever the alliance between Athens and Sparta, and bring Athens over to the Persian side, he would gain both naval strength and a strategic advantage. With Athenian ships, he could either support an assault on the Isthmus, or transport his forces to the eastern Peloponnese, linking up with allies such as Argos and Mantinea to strike Corinth and Sparta from the rear. But what could possibly persuade the Athenians to abandon the Spartans and align themselves with their greatest enemy? Two factors may have made such a shift conceivable. First, the political landscape in Athens was rapidly changing. Themistocles, despite his recent successes, had begun to fall from favor, due in part to perceptions of arrogance and to his increasingly close ties with Sparta. His rivals, likely envious of his influence, sought to undermine him. As Herodotus explains, the Hellenes were unable to take Andros and went to Charistos next and laid waste its land. They then returned to Salamis, and the first thing they did was to set aside the pick of the spoils as offerings to the gods. After dividing the spoils, they sailed onto the Isthmus and set about choosing the man who had shown himself most worthy of an award for excellence in the fighting that year. But when the commanders gathered together and cast their votes at the altar of Poseidon to determine who should be the first choice and who second, each of them voted for himself, thinking he had performed the best. However, a majority gave second place to Themistocles. So, others received only a single vote for first place, while Themistocles had far more votes than anyone else for second. The Hellenes were too full of envy to make the award, and so sailed off homeward without making a decision. All the same, Themistocles was praised to the skies throughout all of Hellas, and rated the cleverest of the Greeks by far. But because he had not received the honor owed him by those who fought at Salamis, he immediately went to Lacedaemon, desiring to be honored there. Indeed, the Lacedaemonians welcomed him warmly and bestowed great honors on him. They presented Eurybiades with an olive wreath as his reward for excellence, and gave a similar wreath to Themistocles for his cleverness and quick-wittedness. They also presented him with the finest chariot in Sparta, sent him off home with the 300 picked Spartans who are known as the Knights to escort him as far as the Aegean border. Themistocles was the only man known to have ever been given such a send-off by Spartans. When Themistocles returned to Athens, Timodamus of Aphidnae ranted and raged at him for visiting Lacedaemon. He was one of his political opponents, though otherwise of no distinction, and was insanely jealous of the man. He argued that the honors he had received from the Lacedaemonians were actually earned by the city of Athens, not Themistocles personally. Timodamus carried on in this vein, until Themistocles retorted, "Absolutely right. If I came from Belbina, I would not have been so honored by the Spartans. But nor would you have been, dear sir, even though you are from Athens." And that put an end to that. After this series of events, we never hear about Themistocles from Herodotus again, and he also doesn't appear in the campaigns of 479 BC. Diodorus Siculus may have an explanation for this. After the Battle of Salamis, all of Hellas credited the Athenians with victory. They became puffed up with pride, and it was plain to all that they intended to challenge the Lacedaemonians for command of the fleet. The Lacedaemonians anticipated this, and were eager to deflate their arrogance. And so, when a vote was called to determine who should receive the awards for valor, they used their influence to secure the prize for Aegina out of all the cities, and the individual prize for Amenius of Athens, the brother of the poet Aeschylus, because he was in command of the trireme that had been first to ram the Persian flagship, sinking it and killing the admiral. When the Athenians showed their anger at this unjustified slight, the Lacedaemonians were afraid that Themistocles, in his annoyance with what they had brought about, would plan some great evil against them and the rest of the Hellenes. So, they honored him with twice the share of booty given to those who had been awarded the prize of valor. When Themistocles accepted this, the Athenian assembly took away his generalship and gave it to Xanthippus. Whether due to his perceived arrogance, his close ties with Sparta, or other factors, Themistocles may have simply failed to be re-elected as general in 479 BC. His replacement, Xanthippus, was the father of the man who would later become one of the most influential and respected Athenians in history, Pericles. With this shift in leadership, Mardonius may have sensed an opportunity in the spring of 479 BC to open discussions for an alliance. Before proceeding, however, he consulted several oracles. As Herodotus tells us, Mardonius, while wintering in Thessaly, had sent a Carian called Mies to travel round and consult as many oracles as possible. I don't know what Mardonius wanted to find out from the oracles when he gave Mies this task, because no one has been able to tell me. But I suppose he wanted to know what they had to say about his present business, and that was all. Though he may have been a bit superstitious, Mardonius likely consulted the oracles and made it publicly known that he did in order to curry favor with the local Greeks. Not only did this demonstrate his respect for the gods of Hellas, but he would have also have offered generous gifts, or bribes, as some might say, to each oracle in exchange for, if not a favorable response, then at least a helpful one. In this case, it also signaled to the Hellenes, especially the Athenians, that what he was about to offer had been endorsed by heaven. The Athenians would have required an extraordinary generous offer to even consider an alliance with Persia. Xerxes and Mardonius likely discussed this in advance, formulating terms they believed might appeal to them. To deliver the proposal, Mardonius chose a Greek intermediary, someone who might persuade the Athenians that serving the great king was not as intolerable as they imagined. The man selected for this role was Alexander I of Macedon, who, along with his kingdom, had proven to be a loyal vassal of the Persian Empire during the recent war. Although his sister had married the Persian general Bubaris, this didn't prevent Alexander from receiving high civic honors in Athens. In this sense, he appeared to be the ideal emissary for Mardonius. According to Herodotus, Mardonius read whatever it was the oracles had to say, and then sent Alexander of Macedon as his envoy to Athens. He chose him partly because he had family connections with Persia, and partly because he knew of his service to Athens as Proxenos and benefactor. He thought he could use Alexander to win the Athenians over, having heard that they were both numerous and valiant as a people. He also understood that they had been the chief architects of the disaster that had befallen the Persians at sea. He was confident that he could easily achieve superiority at sea if he succeeded in winning the Athenians over, and this would indeed have been the case. He thought he was much the stronger on land anyway. So, this was how he reckoned he could gain the upper hand over the Hellenes. Perhaps the oracles had foretold this and advised Mardonius to form an alliance with the Athenians, and perhaps it was in obedience to them that he sent Alexander as his envoy. With his usual flair for drama, Herodotus recounts Alexander of Macedon's supposed speech before the Athenian assembly, delivering Xerxes' offer to the Athenians. It's unlikely that the speech and subsequent negotiations occurred exactly as he describes, or even in a single sitting. More likely, Herodotus drew on a combination of sources, perhaps eyewitness accounts, collective memory, and any written records available, to reconstruct the tone, key arguments, and portions of what was said, which may have gone something like this. So, Alexander came to Athens as Mardonius' envoy. This is the speech he gave. "Men of Athens," Mardonius says, "I have a message from the great king. I forgive the Athenians all the wrong they have done me. Mardonius, this is my command. Return their land to the Athenians, and let them take for themselves more besides, whatever land they wish. Let them live under their own laws. And, if indeed they wish to agree terms with me, you shall rebuild all their temples, which I burnt down. These are the great king's commands, which I must obey. And now, hear what I, Mardonius, have to say. Why are you so insane as to wage war against the great king? You cannot defeat him, and you cannot hold out against him forever. You saw the size of his army and what it's capable of. You know the power of the force I now command. Even if you defeat us and win victory, another, much larger army will come along. So, don't even think of trying to measure up to the great king. you will lose your land and be running for your lives forever. Make peace with the great king instead. You can do this on the best possible terms, because he wills it so. Stay free and form an alliance with us without trickery or deceit." Alexander continued, "Athenians, that was the message Mardonius charged me with delivering to you. For my part, I will make no mention of the goodwill I have shown you, which you would not be hearing about for the first time anyway. But it is my earnest wish that you accept what Mardonius proposes. I can see clearly that you will not be able to go on fighting a war with Xerxes forever. If I had seen that you were able to, I would never have come before you to make such a speech. But the great king's might is beyond human, and his arm is long. So, I fear for you if you do not immediately agree a treaty while the terms offered to you are so excellent. Out of all the Hellene allies, your land lies most directly in the path of invasion, and it never escapes devastation. The land you possess is marked out as a battleground. Accept the great king's offer, for it is the great thing for you that he is ready to forgive you, only you, out of all the peoples of Hellas, your offenses, and that he wishes to be your friend." That was the speech Alexander gave. In summary, Xerxes offered the Athenians the following. 1. Full amnesty for all previous acts of aggression against Persia, including those committed under his father, Darius. 2. The right to govern themselves as they wished, meaning they could retain their democracy. 3. Recognition of Athens as the leading power in Greece, along with the promise of additional territory, though one wonders how the Boeotians, or even Alexander of Macedon, might have viewed such a concession. 4. The restoration of all temples and city walls destroyed during Xerxes' invasion. And 5. Substantial financial support. In return for these extraordinary terms, the Athenians were expected to enter into a formal alliance with Persia and support Xerxes in future campaigns, most immediately against Sparta and its allies for control of the Peloponnese. On the surface, this was a remarkably generous offer, one that could have made Athens more prosperous than ever, and perhaps even the leading polis in Greece. Yet, it came at a steep cost: submission to the Persian king as their ultimate overlord, and the betrayal of their Spartan and Peloponnesian allies. Notably, a Spartan delegation was present at the assembly, and, understandably, they were far from pleased with what had just transpired. Herodotus offers us a glimpse into the spirited exchange that followed. So, when Alexander had finished, the envoys from Sparta joined the debate. "We have been sent by the Lacedaemonians to urge you not to do Hellas grievous harm by accepting the great king's terms. That would be an unjust and disgraceful thing for any Hellene to do, but most of all for you Athenians. There are a number of reasons. It was you who stirred up this war, which we had no wish for. From the start, the fighting was over your land, and now all Hellas is involved. That apart, it is intolerable that, on top of it all, you Athenians, who have been known of old as liberators on many occasions, should become responsible for the enslavement of Hellas. Nevertheless, we grieve with you in your sufferings, not least the loss of 2 harvests and the ruin of your prosperity over such a length of time. By way of compensation, the Lacedaemonians and their allies formally announce that they will take into their care your women and all other non-combatant members of your households for as long as this war lasts. Do not let Alexander the Macedonian seduce you by adding his own polish to Mardonius's words. Isn't this how this tyrant would behave, conspiring with a tyrant? But not you, if you are in right minds. For you know that barbarians cannot be trusted or believed. That was the speech the Spartan envoys gave. The Athenians responded to Alexander first. We do know that the power of the Mede is far greater than ours, so there is no need to criticize us on that count. All the same, we will do our very best to defend ourselves, to preserve our freedom. But do not attempt to mislead us into agreeing to the barbarians' terms. We will not agree. So, go back now and tell Mardonius what the Athenians have to say. As long as the sun holds his present course, we will never, ever agree terms with Xerxes. We will come out and fight him, putting our trust in our allies, the gods, and the heroes to whom he showed no reverence when he burnt their shrines and their statues. As for you, do not ever again appear before the Athenians with such a proposal, and never again try to persuade us to do wrong under the pretext of granting us a favor. We would not want something untoward to happen to our Prosinos and friend. That was the answer the Athenians gave Alexander. And now, this was the Athenians' reply to the Spartan envoys. The Lacedaemonians are only human to fear that we will agree terms with the barbarian. But we think it shameful that you should think such a thing, familiar as you are with the spirit of the Athenians. There is no gift of any amount of gold, no gift of lands surpassing all others in fairness and riches anywhere on earth that could persuade us to medize and condemn Hellas to slavery. There are many powerful considerations that stop us doing this, even if we wanted to. First and above all, we must fully avenge the burning and destruction of the images and shrines of our gods, and give no thought to any kind of treaty with the man who committed these crimes. Then, there are the things that make us Hellenes, our shared origins and our language, the shrines of our gods and the sacrificial rites that we have in common, and our very way of life. It would be a terrible thing for Athens to betray all of that. If by any chance you do not already know this, be assured that so long as there is one Athenian standing, we will agree no treaty with Xerxes. Nevertheless, we are deeply touched by your concern for us, your recognition of the ruination we are suffering, and your offer to take households into your care. That is extremely generous of you, but we shall continue to hold out as best as we can without becoming a burden to you. However, with circumstances as they are, you must now send out your army with all speed. We reckon that it will not be long before Mardonius is here, bearing down upon us as soon as he receives our message that we will not do what he demands. Now it is time for us to march out together to meet him in Boeotia before he reaches Attica. That was the Athenians' reply, and the envoys returned to Sparta. If there had been any doubt until this point, Athens' position was now unmistakably clear. Under no circumstances would they form an alliance with the Persian Empire. They were committed to resisting Mardonius until Hellas was free. Even had the Athenians been tempted to reconsider, there was no guarantee that Mardonius would honor his promises once he had secured their support. Yet while the Athenian response was filled with patriotic fervor and generous praise for Sparta, it rang hollow to many in the assembly, especially to non-Athenians. Everyone understood that in any land battle against Mardonius, the Spartans and their Peloponnesian allies would bear the brunt of the fighting. Some Athenians may have considered this only fair. After all, it was their navy that had played a decisive role at Salamis, and now it was Sparta's turn to contribute through its strength on land. Many Spartans, however, saw matters very differently. They had already lost a king and some of their finest warriors at Thermopylae. Moreover, their steadfast defense of the Isthmus of Corinth had thus far held the Persian advance in check. Why then should they, or any of their Peloponnesian allies, risk everything by marching north to fight in distant regions like Boeotia or Thessaly? This was the question weighing on the minds of several leading Spartans. To say Mardonius was displeased with the Athenian response would be an understatement. Perhaps he had anticipated it, for almost immediately upon receiving their answer, he marched with a large portion of his army, including many Greek contingents, toward Athens, intent on making the city regret its decision. According to Herodotus, when Alexander had come back and told him what the Athenians had said, Mardonius led his army off towards Athens at a brisk pace. On the way, he gathered troops from all the places he passed through. The leaders of Thessaly did not regret what they had already done and helped him on his way with even greater enthusiasm. Thorax of Larissa, who had helped Xerxes in his flight, now openly gave Mardonius safe passage into Greece. When the army reached Boeotia, the Thebans tried to keep Mardonius there, advising him that he could find no better country than theirs for his base. They insisted that he go no further, but stay where he was and find ways of conquering the whole of Hellas without having to fight a battle. They pointed out that it would be difficult even for the whole world to overcome the Hellenes by force of arms if those who were currently united stayed together. But if you take our advice, the Thebans argued, you will be able to find out their true states of mind with little difficulty. Send cash to the men in positions of influence in their cities, and by doing this, you will split Hellas apart. After that, with the help of those who have come over to your side, you will easily defeat any who oppose you. That was the advice the Thebans offered, but Mardonius ignored it, because it was his burning passion to take Athens for a second time. However, when he reached Attica, he found no Athenians there, as in the previous year, and discovered that most of them were on Salamis or aboard their ships. So, he did capture the city, but it was deserted. 9 months had passed since the great king's capture of Athens and Mardonius's occupation. For the second time, Athens, at least what remained of it, appears to have been deliberately abandoned in anticipation of a Persian attack. After the destruction 9 months earlier, most of its citizens were likely still on Salamis, while efforts to rebuild the city and restore the Acropolis were underway. Mardonius, however, was not seeking to capture a ruined city. His aim was to send a clear message that he still controlled Attica and could strike the Athenians at will. And what more symbolic place to deliver that message than Athens itself? In doing so, he applied intense psychological pressure on the Athenians. But was it effective? Herodotus offers an answer. When Mardonius reached Athens, he sent a man from the Hellespont called Morichidas to Salamis, bearing the same offer of terms that Alexander the Macedonian had presented to the Athenians. He made this offer for the second time because, though fully aware of the Athenians' hostile reaction to it on the first occasion, he was hopeful that they would relent from their obstinate folly now that Attica was under the power of his spear. That was his purpose in sending Morichidas over to Salamis. He came before the council and delivered Mardonius' message, and Lycidas, one of its members, said that it seemed to him that the best course was to receive the offer brought to them by Morichidas and lay it before the people. He proposed this either because he had been bribed by Mardonius, or even because he liked the idea. However, it made the rest of the Athenians in the council furiously angry, and had the same effect on the crowd outside when they got word of it. They gathered around Lycidas and stoned him to death. though they did allow Murikides the Hellespontian to leave unharmed. Salamis was in uproar because of this business, and when the women of Athens heard what had happened, they passed the word to each other and went on their own initiative to Lycidas' house and stoned his wife and children to death. The murder of Lycidas by his fellow Athenians likely shocked even the most patriotic and staunchly anti-Persian citizens, while also silencing anyone who might have considered medizing. It revealed that many Athenians had reached a breaking point. At the same time, resentment towards Sparta was growing, as the Spartans had failed to come to Athens' aid once it became clear that Mardonius was marching back into Attica. To both request assistance and rebuke Sparta for its perceived lack of commitment to the anti-Persian cause, the Athenians sent a delegation to meet with the Ephors, also pronounced Ephors, who were the 5 annually elected Spartan officials who shared power with the kings and played a central role in governance. The envoys are reported to have said, "When the Athenian envoys arrived in Lacedaemon, bringing with them the envoys from Megara and Plataea, they came before the Ephors and said, 'The Athenians have sent us to tell you that the king of the Medes is ready to give us back our country, and wishes us to be his allies on fair and equal terms, without trickery or deceit, and will grant us any land we may choose in addition to our own. But because we respect Zeus, the god of Hellas, and would think it a dreadful crime to betray Hellas, we have not consented, even though the rest of the Hellenes are doing us wrong by betraying us utterly. We know that there will be more profit for us in agreeing terms with the king than in fighting a war with him. But no, we will not willingly agree terms with him. There is absolutely no deceit in our dealings with fellow Hellenes. But what of you? You were terrified that we might agree terms with the great king. But now that you have a clear idea of our intentions and are assured that we will never betray Hellas, now that the wall which you are building across the isthmus is well on the way to being finished, you do not care about us. You have abandoned us in spite of the promise you made that you would confront the Persians in Boeotia, and you have permitted the barbarians to march into Attica. The people of Athens are now incensed by your dishonorable behavior and insist that you send an army to return with us with all speed to meet the barbarians in Attica. Since Boeotia is lost, the most suitable place in our territory to give battle is the Thriasian plain." The Ephors listened to the Athenian complaints, but offered no response for 10 days. With the wall at the isthmus nearing completion, it's possible that they, and other Spartan leaders, felt confident in their ability to repel any Persian attack and remain secure within the Peloponnese. However, on the day before the Athenian envoys were set to depart, a prominent Aegean named Kilios confronted the Ephors on the matter. Herodotus recounts the following. On the day before what would have been the Athenian delegation's final hearing, Kilios, a Tegean, who had more influence with the Lacedaemonians than any other outsider, asked the Ephors exactly what the Athenians had been saying to them. When they told him, he promptly replied, "Ephors, gentlemen, this is how it is. If the Athenians are not in league with us, but join with the barbarians in an alliance, wide gateways into the Peloponnese will swing open before the Persians, however strong a wall you throw across the isthmus. You must take heed of what they are asking before they decide to do something that will bring about the fall of Hellas." This was the advice Kilios gave to the Ephors, and they immediately took it to heart. They said nothing to the envoys who had come from Athens, Plataea, and Megara, but they gave orders for 5,000 Spartans to march that night with 7 helots assigned to each of them. they put Pausanias, son of Cleombrotus, in command. So, Pausanias and his men set off from Sparta, and, at daybreak, the envoys came before the ephors, but they knew nothing of this and had actually decided to depart themselves and go back home. They came before the ephors and said, "Now stay where you are, Lacedaemonians. Keep your Hyacinta. Have fun in your celebrations, and betray your allies utterly. Wronged by you and lacking allies, the Athenians will agree the best terms they possibly can with the Persians. It is plain to see that we will then become the great king's allies and campaign on his side against any land, wherever Persia leads us. Then you will find out what you have brought upon yourselves." The ephors' response was to tell them on oath that they believed their army was already at Orestium and on the march toward the foreigners, as this was what they called the barbarians. The envoys were completely unaware of this and questioned the ephors until they had all the facts, which greatly surprised them. They set off after the army as quickly as they could, and 5,000 Lacedaemonian hoplites, the pick of the Perioikoi, left with them. So, they pressed on towards the isthmus. Any army marching from Sparta to the isthmus would have passed near Argos. Given the continued hostility between the two states, the Argives sent a messenger to Mardonius, warning him of these troop movements. Herodotus tells us, "As soon as the Argives found out that Pausanias and his men were on the march from Sparta, they sent the fastest long-distance runner they could find as a herald to Attica. They had previously promised Mardonius that they would keep the Spartans out of the war, but on reaching Athens, this is what he had to say to Mardonius. The Argives have sent me to tell you that the youth of Lacedaemon is on the march, and that the Argives cannot stop them. Good luck with your plans for dealing with this." The herald delivered this message and left, and Mardonius, on hearing it, no longer had any desire to stay in Attica. Before he had this information, he had restrained himself. He wanted to know how things stood with the Athenians and to discover their intentions, so he had not ravaged or pillaged the countryside of Attica because he had remained hopeful that the Athenians would agree to the terms. But when he learned the truth of the matter, that he was not going to persuade them to do this, he withdrew from Attica before Pausanias' army had reached the isthmus. But first, he set fire to Athens, demolishing any wall, house, or shrine that was still standing. He led his army away because Attica was not good cavalry country, and because, if he gave battle there and met with defeat, there would be no escape route except a pass so narrow that a few men could block it. And so, he decided to fall back on Thebes and give battle there on ground suitable for cavalry with a friendly city at his back. Mardonius' objective was to bring the anti-Persian Hellene coalition to a decisive battle, or perhaps a series of engagements. By withdrawing from Attica, he could fight on the more favorable terrain of Boeotia, which was well suited to the Persians' greatest strength, their cavalry. In this friendly region, far from the isthmus, he could also draw more easily on the resources of his Greek allies, including additional troops, food, and equipment. His aim was not to reconquer Attica or immediately invade the Peloponnese, but to weaken his opponents and maintain control over Boeotia. In doing so, he would buy time until Xerxes could return, at a moment of his choosing, with a larger, better prepared force to subdue the remaining Greek territories that had thus far resisted Persian rule. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Also, a very special thanks to Faria Faraji for bringing life to this story with much of his music. Check out his channel for more. There's a link to it in the video description. I'd also like to thank the channel's patrons for making videos like this possible. These include, but are certainly not limited to, Grandkek69, Yap de Graaf, Pasta Frola, Michael Lewis, Daniel Allen, Danny Van Eck, Wenix TV, Robert Morgan, Strobex, Blitzkrieg, Krishan Morali, Frank, Tim Lane, Sebastian Otada Korea, Michael Trudell, Leader Titan, Micah G, John Scarberry, William O'Brien, Andrew Bomer, Connor Dolson, Krish, Ben Van Rysvik, David R., Stephen Ball, Gabe, Monty Grimes, Franz Robbins, Diane Astra, Cyrus Mir, Nimrod Nir, Hypnosen, Brendan Redmond, Faridun Dadachanji, Jimmy Darawala, Inahida Debu, Gulistan Debu, Sherkam, Farhad Kama, and all of the channel's patrons on Patreon for helping to support this and all future content. Check out the benefits to being a Patreon member, and if you'd like to join, feel free to click the link in the video description. You can also follow History with Sai on Instagram, Facebook, and X, as well as continue to listen to special audio programs on the History with Sai podcast. Thanks again, and please stay safe.